Greetings everyone, welcome to the video, and in this video I'm going to be teaching you how to paint up the Sons of Horus, and we're going to look at some alternative weathering schemes that you can apply to pretty much any of your miniature painting, which will include some panel lining with acrylics and also using some pigment powders. The Sons of Horus was one of the first ever videos that I probably put out on this channel, and I think it's about time for a little update with the release of the new Horus Heresy box set. So as you can tell, I've done a little bit of kit bashing with this Mark II Marine, and I've just used a different hand from the Krieg set to give him a sort of a spear, and then just added some pistols from the other Horus Heresy box sets that are available. But I just like to add some little tweaks here and there to my miniatures to make them a little bit custom. If you are interested and want to know some more materials that I have used, or some additional materials that you can use to help you kit bash your miniatures and make them that little bit more grimdark, then you can check this video out right here. But with all that said, what I've done with this miniature once I've given him a build is I've primed it in Stynel Res Black Primer, and then just gave it a zenithal of Stynel Res Grey Primer. So if you've got any sort of primers lying about, you can do this with rattle cans, anything like that that you desire. Also, that grey is going to help us reach opacity a little bit quicker with the first base coat colours. And as always, I will be using an airbrush in this video. That doesn't mean that you can't achieve the same or similar results using a brush. All the colours still apply, and you can mix them all the same. You don't need an airbrush to do this. However, if you do want some resources to be able to get that look, then I'd highly recommend heading over to the Artist Opus and learning their dry brushing series, because this can just make everything look like it's also being airbrushed. But with all that said, let's jump straight into it. So the colour recipe for this armour, you've just seen one of the first colours on screen, which is Citadel's Incubi Darkness. Now I know this is usually done with Lupercal Green, but I just sort of like the darker and more bluish, cooler tone that this colour offers. After that, we're going to hit it with the Sons of Horus Green. Now this is where a little bit more of the control starts to come in. So if you're doing it a dry brush or airbrushing, this is where you want to start to pull in things a little bit tighter. So first of all, we're just going to be hitting some highlight points on this miniature and trying to make them really tight. So the main colour is sort of going to be the Incubi Darkness, and the highlights are going to be the Sons of Horus Green. Now if you've not got much brush control, you will get away doing this in just a zenithal. So that's like putting it at a 45-degree angle and just spraying the miniature from above, and it'll leave that shadow behind. But if you notice what I'm doing, I've lowered my pressure to around 15 to 20 psi, and then I'm just hitting those brightest points and letting the overspray slightly leak out and create those nice light transitions. Now if you're unsure of how to and where to put the light on your model, I sort of always do the same, with the light casting down from the left hand side looking at the model, and then I just start to hit those points that would naturally hit the light. But I'm just making sure that everything is nice and tight and leaving that Incubi Darkness in the shadows. And if you do make any mistakes, you can just go straight back to your Incubi Darkness and just blend those shadows back in. But after this, I'm going to add one more additional highlight, just very tight to selected areas such as the shoulder pauldrons, the front of his chest, and a little bit of his kneecap and the back of his leg. Now to achieve that final highlight, usually it's done with seborrheic green, but I find that a little bit too saturated for the grimdark style. So all I did was mixed 50-50 the Sons of Horus Green with a little bit of ice yellow, and there's many brands that offer these ice yellow colours. You can even use white if you want to do that, and I've just again pulled in really tight this time to just get those final highlight points. And when you're done, you'll have a miniature that's got a nice little bit of contrast, and it speaks to the Sons of Horus colour of their armour. And then also you've got those nice bright and highlighted points between the contrast and the shadows. I do find at this point going in now and blacking out everything else that you've got your overspray on or that you're going to be painting a little bit later on. You can see in this video the sort of points that I've gone in there and painted black. It's not necessary to do it all, but you know, it's just one that I've done just so I can sort of see where I am with the armor. Now this first portion of the video is going to be concentrating on the armor and all that sort of stuff. So now is a really good point if you want to add some decals to your miniature, then this is a really good time to do it. I've used the Horus Heresy, the actual transfers that they sell separately, and these are available from Element Games as well now in my affiliate links, which you'll see a little bit later on. But I've just used Microset and Microsol to be able to put these onto the miniature, and just using a Q-tip which I've dipped in the Microset, or the red one should I say, I always get them mixed up which way around they go, and then I just use that to roll it to push out any bubbles and just make sure that it's nice and pushed into that surface. There's no gloss varnish or anything like that needed when applying these. However, once you've given them ample time to dry, then it's a good time to go in there and just make sure everything's all sealed in really nice. And I just gave the entire miniature a very quick coat of satin varnish. But make sure that everything is dry before applying that satin varnish. But whilst those are drying and dissolving into the surface, whilst you're waiting for that, you can move on to weathering. Just before you apply your satin varnish, I'd advise just adding a little bit of weathering. And all I've done here is got some sponging added, a very small amount of sponge chipping to his armor. Then after that, using Sons of Horus green on its own, I'm going to then come in and edge highlight it. Now I'm not going to edge highlight in the traditional fashion like Games Workshop would do. I'm just going to come in there and just highlight under some of those little chips just to fetch them out and make them look a little bit more 3D. And I almost do like a broken up edge highlight only on some of the main highlight points just to reinforce some of those areas and add a little bit more contrast. And if you want to add some scratches and stuff into there as well, you can. And an optional extra step with these chips, which is entirely up to you, if you've got a little bit of like Iron Warriors or a silver metallic, you can just go in there and dab in a right little bit just before you move on to the next stages. But it's at this point now, once you've added your chips and everything's dry, then you're going to seal everything in so that the armor is consistent with everything else. Then we're going to add that satin varnish before moving on to the next stages. Moving on to metallics now, and I'm going to be starting off with the silver metallics, and this is just a recipe that I use 90% of the time when I'm trying to quickly and effectively paint a piece. And I'm going to start off, and basically all you need is a dark silver and a light silver. So if you've got any of choice, feel free to do that. I use Iron Warriors and then Rung Fang Steel as an highlight. Now it's the way that we apply them that is important, and it's just using stippling and a little bit of dry brushing. Now the reason I do it this way is one, because we've got that black undercoat and it's going to show through a little bit onto there, but because of that dry brushing, it leaves like these microscopical little scratches and marks around the miniature, which lean more into that battle worn and grimdark style. But then after I've done that, that's when I come in with a Rung Fang Steel or the brighter silver just to pick out some of those edges, and then you'll be left with this nice little contrasty piece where you don't need any edge highlighting or panel lining, anything like that. It sort of already does the work for you, and because of that dry brush, we're almost building in a little bit of that like scratching and weathering automatically. Now when it came to the bronze or the gold metallic sections, I've started off with Pro Acryl Dark Bronze, and I've specifically gone for this colour because it's a really nice base coat for gold or like a bronze, and it's got like a really nice warm tone to it. And very similar to how we've done the dry brushing with the silver metallics, I'm going to be using just a normal brush and just sort of scratching and sketching them in. I'm almost leaving some of that black behind in some of the recesses, which again will lead to that weathering effect. Now to highlight that, I've just used Scale 75's Peridot Alchemy as one final additional highlights for the gold. Now for flags or any skulls that you may have in and around your miniature, I've used this same recipe on both, and I've given it a base coat of AK dark brown, and then I've slowly started to add some dragon fang to that from 2 thin coats, and then finally a very final sketchy highlight of 2 thin coats vampire fang. You don't need to be really neat with these if you want to resort back to dry brushing. This is a really good way to build up some texture and also pick out those raised edges. It's a really easy way, but I also like to go in there and sketch those highlights in, and this includes both the flag and the skulls. Now this next part is a tip that I don't usually share here on YouTube, but I thought I'd share it with you guys because I think it's an essential part of, you know, adding washers and panel lining. Now usually you'll see me do this with like Goon's Grime and enamels and all that sort of stuff, but with this I wanted a bit more of a neater, cleaner look, if you can get neat and clean with Grimdark. But it's also a really good way to add some panel lines. It does require a little bit of accuracy. Now usually we tend to go in here with like Nun oil or Agrax Surfshade or some sort of wash that'll just go and like flow into the recesses. Now I'm not going to do that, and I never really use them because I find them a little bit weak and not sort of like punchy enough for what I need. So for this I tend to lean more towards contrast paints, and I just heavily water them down. So my contrast paint of choice for doing this is the contrast paint by Citadel Rattling Grime. It's a really nice darkish black with a tint of brown in there, and I just mix this and thin this down with 2 to 3 parts water depending on how strong you want this effect to be. Now this will work on both metallics and also any other parts of your miniature. Because we've got that satin varnish on there, you are going to get a small amount of capillary action, but obviously there are some dangers to this if you're not too accurate, because what you can do is if you get a bit of overspill, unlike enamels, you can't take it back off. So that's why I mentioned that little bit of accuracy. And speaking of that accuracy, all I do is when he's got like these big panel lines going around his legs and stuff, I sort of just manually brush them in there, and because it's really thin down with water, we can control that and it's just going to flow nice into those recesses. When it comes to metallic areas, you'll see that I'm doing here, I actually mix down some brown contrast paint. So for this I've used the contrast paint Garagax Sewer, and that'll sort of push it into a rust tint, if that makes sense. So we're doing the same sort of effect, but we're sort of tinting it now into that rust tone, and you can also go back in there with your Rattling Grime and do that as well. But I just find using the contrast paints, they are a little bit more punchier, and when we water them down, it's just a lot easier to flow into them recesses. Really quickly, before we get into the final portion of this video, I just want to take a brief moment to tell you about my affiliate link. So if you do want to pick up this miniature and grab the paints and everything that you've seen in this video, then check my affiliate links down below, and I just get a little bit of a kickback from that as well. Also, if you are interested in starting airbrushing, I've got a great video and also some discount, 10% discount code below for both Amazon and their website, where you can purchase some of their airbrushes or starter kits from their website. And finally, also don't forget you can support me over at the Grimdark Compendium's YouTube channel and their site, where I've just finished and completed a course on the Trench Crusade Black Grail. And if you are interested in some of the more in-depth and want to really learn the Grimdark style, then that is the best place to do it. And simply by liking and sharing this video will also be the best way to support me, and it'll automatically enter you into a competition to win this miniature. So if you are interested in winning this miniature, all you've got to do is like, comment and share it to one of your social medias. With all that said, let's jump back into the video. Moving on to some flesh now, and I'll quickly go over the colours and the order that I've used them, and then I'll explain all the little nuances and everything like that, because flesh can be an absolute bugger and little faces to paint for people, especially if you're not used to it. So the colours I've used start off with a base coat of Bugman's Glow, then Kislev Flesh, and then a final highlight of Flayed One Flesh. Now how we're going to apply these is really important, and that's why we're going to be thinning these down with a little bit of water. But essentially each step that we go up, we're going to be adding a little bit more of the colour 50-50 at a time. So first of all, we've got the Bugman's Glow, Then I'm going to add 50% of that to the Kislev flesh, so we've got a 50-50 mix of both. Do another highlight, and then I'm going to use the Kislev flesh on its own as another highlight, and then as a final highlight I'm going to mix in a little bit of flayed one flesh and then flayed one flesh on its own as one final additional highlight. Now doing it this way just ensures that you do get some nice blends and transitions as you're going up, and you're not like sort of adding too much contrast initially first of all. But brush control here is, you know, it does come in handy if you've got good brush control, but don't worry too much about it. You can always dry brush these on, and I can dry brush a little bit with these just normal pointy brushes. That's perfectly fine to that, and you'll just catch those raised edges. But also pay attention to that light placement. So from the left hand side, looking at the miniature coming down, especially where we've got like the highlight points on the armor, is where you also want to be adding the highlights to the actual miniature itself onto his flesh. So he's going to have the brightest point on his left hand side on the forehead, and when we're picking out those highlights, that's when I use the flayed one flesh for your final highlights. Now once all that's done, naturally you may come into a couple of mistakes and you want to add a little bit more definition into that. So I gave the entire flesh area a wash of Citadel's Targor Rage Shade, and this will just go in there and it'll tint it and knock it back a little bit if you've gone a little bit too bright. And there's nothing wrong as well with going up and down these colours. If you want a little section to be a little bit darker or stipple some in, you can always do that, but just make sure that you are picking out that definition. Now it is a really small miniature, and for the eyeballs I thinned down some black paint just really thinly, almost turning that acrylic paint, that black paint, into a wash, and I just let this run and flow around the eyes. Now typically it's not really recommended if you're doing a showcase piece, but for something like this, which is a bit more like army or a slight display piece, is just a standard warrior, just adding that blackness around the eyes really creates a lot of definition, especially when looking at the miniature from a distance. Some final weathering to add. I've watered down some of the verdigris effects. So a lot of brands sell these verdigris effects, and all I've done is gone in there because they can be really strong on their own, but I just water them down quite a lot again into a wash consistency, and then start to apply them to the gold or the bronzy areas of the miniature just to add some additional weathering steps to those parts. And then finally, this is something I like to do with my weathering using pigment powders. Now if you've never used pigment powders, they are a great tool to add to your arsenal for both bases and everything like that. But what I've done here is I've watered them down on my wet palette really heavily with water, again into a wash consistency, and then just very lightly applied them here and there around the miniature. Now when you first put it on, you're not really going to see the effects first of all, but as that water starts to evaporate, leaving that pigment behind, it's going to leave it really dusty and chalky. And then what it does, it takes a little bit of time to set and cure, and all I do then is just grab a clean dry brush and just dust it off, leaving it in the recesses or even just leaving some parts exactly as they are. Now this will just add a little bit more weathering to the miniature, as though some of that dust and dirt and grime has settled into the recesses, or alternatively it can result in some sort of rust effects as well if you want to go down that route, and depending on what colour that you used. Now with the pigment powders as well, I always recommend, depending on your basing scheme, to always dust a little bit up onto the legs just to tie the miniature into its environment. And that sort of brings us to the end of this tutorial, so I hope you have enjoyed it. And don't forget, if you do want to win this exact miniature, then all you have to do is be a subscriber, like the video, share it to one of your social media sites, and comment below when you've done that to be automatically entered into a competition to win this miniature. And that will be drawn in a couple of videos time, so make sure you are stay tuned, because I do have a ton of videos coming with a new Horus Heresy. I don't know what you guys are, and I know they kicked up a bit of a stink in the Warhammer community, but I've got a ton of videos coming because I absolutely love the Saturnine armor. The big chunky boys are right up my street, and I've got a couple of videos coming on them, so make sure you are subscribed to not miss out on any future videos. And with all that said, I've been Nate the Feral Painter, and I will catch you in my next video.